All right, everyone, welcome, welcome. We are going to begin period 3 today. So here we are looking at conflict and American independence. Specifically, when we think of this time period, think of conflict, think of nation building, and think of expansion. So here we have our timeline. Nothing specific I want to point out for this one. These are events that you should readily know, things that we have covered in class. These are kind of the big ticket items for this period. So make sure when you go through this, you are aware of each of these events and kind of the significance of each. Let's look specifically now at the French and Indian War. When we take a look at this, this is part of the 7 Years' War. This is the interesting part of the 4-part series of all these European wars because this one actually starts in the colonies. It starts in the New World. It's the only one of the 4 that does so. So the British keep losing, at this point to the French and Indians. And so one of the things they call for is the Albany Congress in 1754. And they call for a more organized response to the attacks that are happening. Now, keep in mind, all of this is happening because the English keep encroaching on those French lands. And so the French feel attacked. The British keep pressing west. So that is part of the issue. And when we take a look at these battles, we understand that even though the majority of the Native Americans supported the French, we do know the Iroquois specifically support the English in this. So it's not even that, when we look at French and Indian, keep in mind it's really the French and the majority of the Native Americans against the British and the navies. So at this Albany Congress in 1754, they called Congress for representatives from every one of the colonies. And Ben Franklin proposes something called the Albany Plan of Union, which calls for a more centralized form of government in the colonies, and it would allow them to have a more coordinated effort for Western defense. But the issue is taxation is needed for this to happen. And so many people were not super excited about this idea and the plan was rejected. But this is going to lay the future for the Revolutionary Congress we're going to see later. So this plan that starts in 1754 may not come to fruition in 1754, but it absolutely lays the base for what we're going to see for the American Revolution. So then we have the Treaty of Paris. This war removes the French. In the end, the British do win, but this war removes the French from North America as far as, except for Canada, but pretty much removes them from North America. And this is a power shift in favor of the British. Louisiana Territory is given to Spain, and the British more than double their land holdings, taking all land east of the Mississippi River. A conflict does emerge between the American colonists and the natives as colonists seek to expand. A great exemplar of this would be Pontiac's Rebellion. Chief Pontiac rebelled against the British colonists, so the British responded by issuing that proclamation line of 1763. It's that line that they are not supposed to go west of. This is going to very much upset the colonists. They thought that they were fighting the French and Indian War in order to go west. And now the British are saying, congratulations, we've won the war, but you cannot go past this war and past this line. The whole point of it is the British did it to protect the colonists, to protect trade. But that is not how they're going to see that. Colonists are going to be very resentful of this. And this also causes the end of salutary neglect because the British are broke. They have no more money. They've waged all these wars. Their debt doubled during this, and the cost to run the colonies went up 5 times over. And so they felt like we fought this war to protect you, to defend you, so you now need to pay some money for it. And the colonists do not like that idea at all. The French and Indian War drastically and forever changes the relationship between the British and the colonists. So keep that in mind. That is a key event. So we do see the end of salutary neglect. The British are really too involved with foreign issues and problems of their own up until the end of the French and Indian War in order to deal with the United States. But we see the year 1763 as that turning point year. It's a turning point year in the relationship between the colonies and England. It ends salutary neglect because England has that massive debt, and they begin to set forth a series of policies, and you can see I've listed a bunch of them there from 1763 to 1776. And there's various things that they did, and it's a buildup. Understand that this idea of rebellion doesn't just come from nowhere. It comes from over a decade's worth of policies being enacted and the colonists becoming very upset about that happening. So, what are some of these things that happen? We have the enforcement of the Navigation Acts. This is something that the colonists had frankly been avoiding because they'd just been smuggling goods, but now they're being enforced. We have obviously that Royal Proclamation of 1763, that line. We have the Sugar Act that comes through in 1764, where they put taxes on coffee and wine and luxury items. And they begin fulfilling and carrying out a tax that they actually had on the books already for molasses. With the Quartering Act of 1765, which says the British can enter their homes and imperial troops could stay there to enforce laws. The Stamp Act of 65, which raises revenue on all papers. And I will say this is the point, once this act goes through, this is where the colonists themselves begin to make that point. Well, is it fair that we have taxation without representation? Parliament argues you do have representation, you have virtual representation. Colonists do not agree in virtual representation. They say they do not have any representation at all. You have the Declaratory Act of 1766 that basically says we can pass any law we want in the colonies. And they do that because they do repeal, obviously, some of the other acts because the colonists are so upset, but then they immediately pass that act saying, but just you remember, we are the ones in charge, so we can pass it if we want to. We have the Townshend Acts, which are passed to tax paper and glass and tea. This leads to a lot of protests. People begin to boycott goods. People begin to spin their own cloth and brew their own tea. We then have the Tea Act of 1773, which taxes tea. We know some of the things that happen because of that. And we have the Intolerable Acts of 1774, also called the Coercive Acts, which closes the Boston Harbor until all the tea is paid for, because obviously the Boston Tea Party happens. And it is also where we begin to see them organize to protect against what they see as British tyranny. And then finally, the Quebec Act of 1774, which isn't actually anything to do with the colonists, but it's something to do with their colonies in France, and it makes the colonists in the 13 colonies really feel like, oh, they're coming for us. They're going to try to take away our religious ideology. They're going to force us to do things we don't want to do. It was not true, but that's how they read it. So all of these together show that Britain is trying to take control of the colonists economically and politically. So let's talk about some of the colonial responses to some of those things that I just discussed. So I just gave you like all the acts all together because I wanted you to have a good sense of what all the acts were together. But now let's take a look and see what some of those responses are. So we do have the Stamp Act riots where they tar and feather British tax collectors. We have the Sons of Liberty that they organize, and they organize to fight the Stamp Act. We have the Stamp Act Congress, which was meant to repeal the Stamp Act. We have 27 representatives from 9 of the colonies. Not all of them came, but 9 did. They assembled in New York, and a result of this was a formal petition to Parliament asking to repeal the Stamp Act. They argued no taxation without representation. They said, if you have that and you don't give us representation, this is, tyranny against the colonists. They said, we're merely British subjects asking for the rights as British citizens. And they got the repeal of the Sugar and Stamp Act. We do see the Boston Massacre in 1770 in response to all the tension for the Townshend Acts. A bunch of people were harassing soldiers. Someone threw some snowballs, some stones. Shots go off. We're still not clear on who the shots went off for, which side. In the end, though, 4 lay dead and 11 wounded. And this, for the colonists, is showing an increase in the power of the British and showing that the British are becoming very tyrannical against the colonists. We see committees of correspondence begin. This is where the colonies themselves begin to actually communicate with each other, writing letters to each other, being sent to each of their colonial legislatures so that they can begin to coordinate ideas. We see the Boston Tea Party, which was in response to the Tea Act of 1773, where a few people dress up like Native Americans and basically toss all that tea into the harbor. And as we've discussed, it's millions and millions and millions and millions of dollars of property damage. We see the Continental Congress. This forms right prior to Lexington and Concord in 1774. The colonists decide that they need to resist further violations of their liberty, but they again are still arguing that they're doing this as British citizens. So these are all examples of colonial identity against the British. These are all things that the colonists do that show that they are their own group and idea of people. But understand there's plenty of people who still stand behind the British. Elites like Paul Revere and John Hancock and some everyday colonists were united against the British, but most of them did not want independence. They just wanted an end to salutary neglect. So that's important to keep in mind. So what is some of the responses during this time with the colonists? So they are guided in a lot of the things that they're deciding and doing by Enlightenment thoughts. So they believe in things like natural rights, that they all have certain rights that are given by God and government can't take it away. They are governed by social contract, that there is a social contract between people and government, and that it is the government's job to uphold that social contract. And if government does not uphold that social contract, people have a right to rebel against it. And the idea of a Republican form of government with separations of power. So all of these ideas come from, that Enlightenment thought. When we take a look at the Second Continental Congress, understand they are still, debating. They're still trying to figure out what's going on. As we take a look at these individuals, understand the people that are leading this really are the elites, but this is a grassroots movement. This is moving from colony to colony, and some of the brightest minds of the colonists are rising up and they are coming together. And they are using different forms of ideas to form a basis. They're creating a government out of something that's never been done before. It's important to keep that in mind. During that Second Continental Congress, they are, debating still, but it does come to a point where they believe finally independence is the only way that their nation, and they're beginning to think of themselves as their own nation, could survive and thrive. But again, these are the elites, and they have to convince the everyday people. And then we see common sense. So Thomas Paine begins to write, and he urges Americans to break away. And he is influenced and helps influence Thomas Jefferson's Declaration of Independence, which is a document that lists the grievances against King George III. And they basically justify why they're breaking away. If it's more of a justification to the rest of the world, they want to make sure that the rest of the world understands why they need to do what they're doing. They don't really want France or Spain or some of the other European powers to come in and help the British. Thomas Jefferson is inspired by common sense. He's inspired by other Enlightenment ideas like natural rights by Locke, by consent of the governed by Rousseau. And this Declaration of Independence is chock filled with Enlightenment ideas. It is made public on July 4th, 1776. But understand there is a sizable amount of loyalists that are in opposition to this. People are still loyal to the British and do not think that this is a good idea at all. And so then we have some key things starting to happen, obviously, with the Revolutionary War. So when we look at the key kind of takeaways, overall, if we just take a look at what's happening with the Revolutionary War, please remember there is the Continental Army. It is obviously taken over by Washington. He leads them. They are defeated often early on in the war. They are ill-trained, they are ill-prepared, they are ill-supplied. Washington does a great job of knowing when to retreat, and he retreats often. When we look 1777, the Battle of Saratoga, this is a turning point. So when we look at different things, we always look at turning points. This is a turning point in the war. It is where they convince the French to enter the war on the side of the Americans. And that is done with the help of Benjamin Franklin, who really is a great diplomat and negotiates with the French to get their help. The British did not have the resources to outlast the colonists. This is important. We are fighting in a place where we can get materials for the war right here. They have very long stretch supply lines where they have to conquer places to get those supplies. And so that becomes difficult. It's something that possibly should be remembered when we talk about future wars, and why when you are way far away from home, sometimes it's very difficult to fight a group of people that are in a locale that are fighting for what they believe is heart and home. And you can make that connection to the Vietnam War. That will be a good connection that you can make between these. The Battle of Yorktown is the last real battle. This Revolutionary War still goes on actually for a little while, just nothing happens. But Yorktown is kind of what we say is the last real battle, the last real issue. So why do they win? They have home field advantage. They know the land. England has to transport those goods a really far distance. Following the Battle of Saratoga, the French jump in and help us. George Washington is an amazing leader, and they have strong beliefs in republicanism and in the ideas of natural rights and consent of the governed. So they have this ideological commitment to this struggle. So then we have steps to the Constitution. It is not the first form of government we have. Obviously, the very first form of government we have is the Articles of Confederation. But the Articles of Confederation is so weak. It is one vote for each state, regardless of the size of the state. Congress cannot lay or collect taxes or duties. Congress cannot regulate foreign or interstate commerce. There is no executive branch to enforce any act of Congress. There's no national court system. There's no provision for military. You can only amend it if every single one of the states agree. It takes a 9-13 majority to pass a law. And the Articles really is just a firm league of friendship. It's very much kind of the idea of 13 separate little countries that are working under a league together. The way I like to think of the Articles of Confederation, it works almost like the European Union in some ways. It's a loose confederation of these groups that are going to work together, but each still sees itself as its own. The weaknesses really show in something called Shays' Rebellion in Massachusetts. Farmers were unable to pay their debts due to the increased taxes, due to the rising inflation, and they made a formal petition to government saying we need relief. They were ignored, so Daniel Shay got 1,000 men and he headed to the town arsenal. The government was too weak to put it down. They ended up having to hire a private militia to stop his advancement, and it proved we need revisions. So there was a call for a constitutional convention. And in the end, this will be replaced, the articles, by a much stronger federal government under this Constitution. Now, when we look at the Constitution itself, obviously this document is a framework. Interestingly enough, that framework has held still to this day. So they did a pretty darn good job of that framework. Understand it is not as specific as one would think. If you compare our Constitution to some other countries' constitutions, they're very, very specific in some things they lay out. And because of that, they have to change their Constitution and amend it often. We clearly do not. What are some of the just kind of key takeaways of our Constitution? So first, we have the Great Compromise. That was incredibly important because it's what allows the Constitution to go forward to begin with. We first have the Virginia Plan. The large states are arguing how they should be represented. And they say it should be based on population. We have the New Jersey Plan. They argue no, it should be equal representation. Every state should get the same amount of representation. And so in the end, they reach a compromise called the Kinetic Compromise, which is we're going to have a bicameral legislature, a two-house. We're going to have a House of Representatives, which is going to be based on population, and we're going to have a Senate, which is going to be equal, 2 votes for every state, no matter how big or how small. The next big issue then they have to overcome is slavery, and they end up settling on something called the 3/5 compromise, and it's 3/5 for both representation and for taxation. So what you did is you looked at the slaves, and for every 5 slaves, 3 counted towards population. And this gives the South a lot of power because of the growing and burgeoning slave population in the South. Now, there is some limits on federal power, but it also expands the power of the federal government with a president, the Supreme Court, with regulation of trade, with the power to tax, all those things that we didn't have under the Articles, they made sure we had in the Constitution. We do have, though, a separation of powers. We have 3 different branches of government, and they are able to check and balance each other. We also have federalism. Federalism is that we have a federal level of government, and we also have state levels of government, and they share power. The federal government has specific powers, the state government has specific powers, and then there's some powers that are shared. And we are based on republicanism, the idea that we have representative government. So how did we know that this worked? Well, we have a rebellion, almost like Shays' Rebellion. Now we have a whiskey rebellion. There was a rebellion in the western part of Pennsylvania over taxation, and it is crushed by the strong central government. Now, I'll say that when we get there, we realize it's just a couple guys, but the response was perfect. Washington was able to call out the troops, and we were able to secure our country. Hamilton, did tax the whiskey. That was one of the things that he was thinking of doing. And that's kind of where this issue comes because remember, out west, it's so difficult to transport crops to the east. Pennsylvania, it's going to rot by then. So what they did is they boiled it all down to whiskey. And so when you tax the whiskey, you're basically taxing their crops. So that's why they were so angry. So Washington was able to federalize 4 state militias, brought them in, and rebellion crushed. All right, the Constitution itself. When we take a look at the Constitution itself, you have to understand there's fighting almost immediately about the Constitution. Okay, almost immediately about the Constitution. You have the Federalists, they're more urban, they want a strong central power. And we have the Anti Federalists, and they're more rural, and they like the idea of states' rights or state power. All right, so Federalists are led by Hamilton, Anti Federalists are led by our guy there, Thomas Jefferson. All right. And we see something called the Federalist Papers. They get released. And this is why the Constitution should be ratified. It is written by Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison. The majority of them are written by Hamilton. And they are trying to convince people why this new plan of government should work. The Anti Federalists felt the new government was too powerful. They did not want to ratify it without the agreement of the passage of a Bill of Rights. They end up deciding, yes, of course we'll pass the Bill of Rights. Is this what is going to get you in order to, have the states agree to this? And because of that, we get the first 10 amendments to the Constitution almost immediately, and they form our Bill of Rights. So that's where the first 10 come from. What are the impacts? What are the impacts of the revolution? Okay. So the American Revolution's democratic and Republican ideals inspired new experiments with different forms of government. All right. Our nation did have a fear of a strong centralized power. We did not want a monarch again. We had already gone through that. We did not want to do that again. But our new government structures are based on Enlightenment principles, on natural rights, on consent of the governed, and on the restriction of government power. When we look politically, understand this is not a radical kind of revolution. This is not like France. France was a radical revolution. That is not this. The colonial elite, when this is over, are still in charge. There's not a radical transformation of wealth, but we see that new people can be engaged in the process. But remember, it's still all white men who are engaged in the process. Internationally, this does have an impact on the world stage. It inspires the French Revolution in 1789, numerous revolutions throughout Latin America, and in the early 1800s, Haiti will go through their own revolution. So it does have far-reaching impacts, but remember, not nearly as radical as like the French Revolution. Also, when we take a look, some other impacts on groups specifically. So when we take a look, let's first look at women. So out of this comes an inspired idea of the Republican motherhood. Now, throughout the course, we will talk about the Republican motherhood. We'll talk about the cult of domesticity. We're going to talk about women's place in culture. So try to keep these ideas together as far as what this means for them. So in the Republican motherhood, the idea is that these women are meant to raise good citizens who are civic minded and involved in the new public's affairs. And so because of that, they have to make sure that the women are educated enough so that they can do that, so that they can teach their sons, especially, how to be civic minded and participate. And so we do see this helps improve education for women during this time period because women are seen as the guiding force of the families. So the idea of the Republican motherhood is that women are going to help raise their children to be good citizens. And so because of that, they themselves need a decent education. We do see, obviously, the first tip-off of the idea of women fighting for rights. We have Abigail Adams. She tells her husband, remember the ladies. He doesn't, but she does suggest it during the American Revolution. But women very much have a lack of political rights. So do not confuse the idea that they have more education with the idea that they're equal in any way. They are not. Women gained few, if any, rights after the Revolutionary War. For instance, married women gave their husbands all their property upon their marriage. When we take a look at African Americans, there is gradual emancipation for African Americans in the northern and middle states. And this will slowly end slavery because it's not economically viable to have them. They don't have the types of economies that need slaves. and it is why it slowly goes away in the North and mid colonies. Pennsylvania has something called the Gradual Emancipation Law that basically says, all right, at this point, anyone born into slavery is free. And so the idea is after a generation, there will be no more slaves there. But the South and the West are very much protected under the Constitution and do continue to have slavery. When we look at Native Americans, there is no protection for them at all in the Treaty of Paris, and no one consults with them and no one asks them. They are completely ignored. Now, at this time, there's also a desire to form a distinct American culture, and we see that emerge for the very first time. There are ambitious plans drawn up for a plan for both state and national education, and there's various artists that paint various historical themes at this time, like Charles Willson Peale and Samuel Jennings. Now, we do have some domestic disagreements at this time. People do not agree on what this new nation should look like. This revolves very much around the Secretary of the Treasury, okay, Alexander Hamilton. So Alexander Hamilton has a financial program, and his financial program is the idea of the assumption plan, first of all, then excise, that should say not excuse, I'm sorry, that should say excise taxes, and then the idea of excise taxes, high tariffs, and a strong national bank. So we take a look at the assumption plan. The federal government was going to assume all states' rights debts, and this would bind the nation together to improve our credit rating, and that passed. Obviously, having excise taxes and high tariffs would give the government more money in the national treasury, and then a strong national bank in order to ensure that there was a place for the government to put the money and also to help regulate the money supply. Critics, though, argued the Constitution didn't allow for any of this. They said that Alexander Hamilton was taking unnecessary choices and going way beyond the scope of the Constitution. But Hamilton argues, no, there is something called the Elastic Clause. I can make all laws, not I, but the president can make all laws, Congress can make all laws necessary and proper. And so that is why it passed. So Hamilton is a federalist who favors a strong central government. He favors manufacturing, and he has a very loose interpretation of the Constitution. But we have Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republicans. So Thomas Jefferson and Madison both, they favor a weak central government. They favor agriculture, and they have a very strict interpretation of the Constitution. And this is going to lead to the growth of political parties. That's where we're going to see that come from. So let's take a look at kind of quickly our first two presidents. So we have 4 cabinet positions that are created from the very beginning. We have state, war, treasury, and justice. Those are the very first that are created. And some of the things that happen very quickly under Washington and under Adams. So when Washington becomes president, he makes Adams his vice president, and he is the one who institutes and creates this cabinet position, okay? And we see a couple things that are passed early on underneath our government. And, when Washington leaves power, he argues obviously against some of the things that are happening. So some of the things that he argues about, we're going to talk about in the next slide, but he makes some very specific arguments about what we should and should not be doing, and kind of sets the stage of he serves 2 terms. That becomes the precedent. It is not going to be broken until Franklin D. Roosevelt. When we look at John Adams, Jefferson is his vice president, which is going to cause some conflict because they do not agree ideologically on anything because the way it was set up for elections early on, not how we do it now, but the top 2 vote getters became president, vice president, and they are of 2 different political parties. So, yikes, that's a problem. The French keep taking our ships at this time. They keep seizing them. And this leads to something we call the XYZ affair, where we go and we try to negotiate, and they basically say, we can't even talk. You can just talk to, these people. And in the documents, we don't even know kind of who they are. And they just call them, we were sent to talk to X, Y, and Z, which means that we see there's a lack of respect for the United States at this time. They're trying to bribe us. They're trying to force us to pay money for this to happen. We also see the Alien and Sedition Acts go through. So at this time, the Alien Act makes it legal and easy to deport any non-citizen from the United States. And this is targeted at the growing Irish and Scottish population who opposed the Federalist sympathies of Britain. The Sedition Act made it illegal to criticize government in any way. The Democratic Republicans are outraged of this. They're saying this is huge federal overreach. This should not happen. The ideas of federal versus state governments can be seen in both the Alien and Sedition Acts and also in the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions. So they are written, the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions are written in response to the Alien and Sedition Acts. They are written by Madison and Jefferson, and they both speak out that they should be able to nullify. And nullification becomes an issue all the way until the Civil War. Becomes a constant cry of people who are states' writers. So nullification is that the state government should be able to nullify, ignore, get rid of any federal law they don't agree with. But that is not true because the Constitution is the supreme law of the land, and it is very clear in the Constitution of the law of supremacy that federal law supersedes state law. But a lot of people aren't going to agree with that, and we're going to see this end up boiling over even this early on, all the way through to the Civil War. We do have a series of foreign disagreements that happened during this time. And this is a listing of some of those foreign disagreements that happened. The French Revolution is going on. We proclaimed neutrality in 1793. Washington says we are too young a nation to get involved. We are not going to get involved in this. Because of that, Citizen Ganneau comes to the United States. He tries to get people to join, and he tries to challenge the neutrality of the United States. He is booted out. We do see the XYZ affair, as I've discussed already, where the French government demands a bribe before they'll even talk to us. And this puts us in what we call a quasi-war, which is where the United States and France are technically at war. As far as on the seas, we'll see them fire on each other, but no one declares war. In the end, we have a convention. It's the Convention of 1800, and this ends the French-American alliance that we have had since 1778. Let's turn to Britain and see what our foreign relations were with them. The Treaty of Paris specifically laid out some things that are supposed to happen that are not happening. And so we still have issues with the British because of it. So there's forts, for instance, British forts still along our soil along the north, and they're supposed to remove them, and then they don't. So it's like having your home built on your neighbor's backyard. It's not supposed to be there, but it's still there. They're also giving guns to Native Americans, and they're impressing U.S. sailors. So we have Jay's Treaty that happens in 1794 with the British, and that is going to very much upset the Democratic Republicans who feel like we are siding with the British over the French. Then we see Spain. Spain has closed us off to Mississippi River trade, and they're beginning to question the boundaries between the United States and Florida. So we end up with the Pinckney Treaty, which gives the United States the right to navigate the Mississippi River, and this settles the border dispute between the United States and Spain. And then finally, we do have Washington's farewell address. Basically, he tells the United States to stay out of all permanent alliances. That's why I have it under foreign disagreements, because he's like, we should not be involved in any of this. Do not get involved in foreign governments and foreign entanglements. And that also, he says, by the way, political parties are really bad. We should not have political parties in the United States. So at this point, the Democratic Republicans favor France and the Federalists favor England. Now let's take a look at our Native Americans and what's happening with them. Specifically, we're looking that migration within North America and that the competition over resources, boundaries, and trade intensifies the conflict between people and different nations. So we know that in the French and Indian War, majority of Native Americans joined the side of the French. We also know that the French lose, and this causes various problems. We already discussed, obviously, Pontiac's Rebellion and the Proclamation Line of 1763. Okay. When we see the Albany Plan, when that went through in 1754, we were seeking the support of the Iroquois. The English and the colonies are trying to get their support. Ultimately, they will, and that will be important. We also obviously see what happens with them in the Revolutionary War, the native side predominantly with the British, but they are completely excluded from the Treaty of Paris. And then when we see the Western Confederacy, so some of the things that happen out west, we see Chief Little Turtle, who will lead a resistance in the Old Northwest against American expansion. We'll see the Battle of Fallen Timbers, where this resistance is crushed, and it ends with the Treaty of Grenville. So native tribes fluctuate at this time in their alliances with the Europeans and with other tribes. And at the exact same time, on the far, far west, we know that the natives are being converted by the Spanish Catholics on the West Coast. And that image there is just some of those Spanish missions that are launched all up and down today, what we would call California. All right, so the United States is going to expand during this time period. More and more people are moving westward, and this fuels social, political, and ethnic tensions. So the best and only thing that the United States was able to accomplish under the Articles of Confederation was the Northwest Ordinance of 1787. And what this did is it developed a plan to admit new states. Once a territory reached 60,000 people, it could then apply for statehood. Slavery was banned there at this time. The very first congressional ban ever happened on slavery in this Northwest Ordinance. It's the first time slavery is restricted. Okay. The territories were beginning to be added under this time. Some of the territories that came in were Vermont, Kentucky, and Tennessee. The United States at this time is based on freedom, but not freedom, not of every single man or woman. That's not how freedom is based. But there is some very distinct regional attitudes that are going to kind of develop as we press west. So in some places like the North, rapid population growth of the free blacks is happening. And in Pennsylvania, African Americans are forming the AME churches. In the South, though, when we see what's happening with African Americans, the population is mostly enslaved. It is also growing rapidly, but laws are making it almost impossible to free those slaves. So as slaveholders begin to migrate into the West, this is going to cause problems because the idea is, can slavery go with you, and what are the laws that are there? So this is going to be a continued problem. Tensions are going to emerge in different areas of the country, East versus West. The East is very much elites. The West is newer money, a lot of poor people, not a lot of government power. The Paxton Boys, you can read about that, obviously, and talk about that, and that will give you a great example of kind of some of the fights that are happening there. Also, the Land Ordinance of 1785, I forgot to mention that, that just establishes this Northwest Territory. It sets up these areas that you see on the map. And then that brings us to the election of 1800. You can see here's a nice election map that we see the Democratic Republicans versus the Federalists. So it's a Jefferson Adams ticket. The Democratic Republicans wins. Thomas Jefferson becomes president. We call this the Revolution of 1800 because it is literally the very first peaceful transfer of power. People in the world really could not believe that we did this. It was shocking to many, many people. And so it sets the stage for what America is. And that's why, in many ways, it's the first true test of this nation because, yes, we transfer power without anyone fighting. So here is listing of different things. Again, I'm going to give you some list of things that can you discuss these things. I would go through them, make sure you can talk about them. Two things that I want to make sure that I do talk about. The very first one is the Revenue Act of 1762. That is something that I do not believe that I discussed in our discussion throughout the slides. This was trying to end colonial bribery and customs officials by rampant smuggling, which had defied the Navigation Acts, and also the Currency Act of 1764 that banned the colonies from using paper money to prevent worthless paper from being able to pay debts. So can you do this? This is the final three questions. Can you do these things in this? So what were the causes and consequences of the American Revolution? Can you write and answer that? How did leading Americans address regional differences to develop a federal government? So we're talking about obviously North and South. We're talking about East and West. And in what ways did migrations across North America intensify conflicts? All right, that brings us to the end of Unit 3, Period 3. So make sure you are studying.